Hey guys, tonight we begin in a place where the air is dry, the Nile is wide, and sandals are optional but strongly recommended. Welcome to ancient Egypt, a land of golden gods, grumpy pharaohs, and wars that tended to start before anyone had a decent breakfast. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, leave a comment with your local time and where you're listening from. My love seeing the little bedtime map grow. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sun hadn't even peeked over the eastern dunes when Horemhotep's scribe, sandals wearer, reluctant early riser, was shaken awake by his younger brother. Something about raiders, maybe Nubians again, maybe just farmers angry about taxes. Either way, it wasn't good news. The family's modest brick home echoed with the clatter of rushed preparations. Outside, a messenger's voice carried over the rooftops, announcing with far too much energy that the southern frontier post had been attacked. Again, and yes, again before breakfast. Across town, soldiers roused from bed and tripped into armor that still smelled like yesterday's heat. Most were professional warriors, broad-shouldered, veterans with sun-scarred skin. But some were farmers recently handed a spear and the divine blessing of "you'll figure it out." Ancient Egypt's army, it turns out, was a mix of full-time fighters and very confused part-timers. The morning moved in fast forward. Horses were hitched to chariots, bronze weapons were checked for rust, and a priest walked along the line of men smearing what he claimed was protective ointment on their foreheads. It smelled suspiciously like goose fat mixed with crushed lotus. No one dared question him by the Nile's edge. Boats bobbed, waiting to ferry reinforcements south. A general paced nearby, muttering about grain rations and celestial omens. When he tripped over a chicken, no one laughed, at least, not where he could hear. As Horemhotep arrived with scrolls tucked under his arm, he was, after all, expected to document the glory, not participate in it. A nearby guard handed him a short sword and said, "Just in case." It was both comforting and deeply alarming. That morning, the air was charged. The river shimmered with a deceptive calm, as if it hadn't just witnessed the tip of a spear break the surface an hour earlier. The locals whispered that crocodiles could smell blood upstream, which was nonsense, probably. Still, fishermen stayed ashore. Back in the palace, Pharaoh Amos was already awake, his eyeliner perfectly symmetrical, his headdress slightly tilted, but his mood absolutely Wars were seasonal, like flooding or tax collection. He glanced at a clay tablet bearing the bad news, sighed, and ordered breakfast, probably honey cakes, possibly imported. Meanwhile, soldiers gathered at the edge of town for a quick blessing from the high priest. He chanted praises to Montu, the war god, waved a bundle of burning herbs, and smacked a few helmets with an ankh for luck. Horemhotep noted all of it, carefully avoiding the part where someone's helmet fell off mid-prayer. The first wave of troops moved south, feet pounding the hardened earth, banners flapping in the dry wind. At the back of the line, two very young recruits debated whether pharaohs ever actually fought or just looked impressive on horses. One of them carried his spear upside down for 3 whole miles. The enemy Nubian raiders probably was known for speed, skill, and showing up when you least wanted them. Stories about their curved bows and terrifying aim were traded like bedtime horror tales. Horemhotep, of course, had written down most of them. Near the border fort, tension clung to the heat. Villagers had taken shelter, hiding grain stores and family treasures in underground pits. One old man claimed he buried his grandmother's necklace next to a very angry snake, just for added security. A small lookout post caught the first glimpse of movement on the horizon. Dust clouds kicked up by distant figures. It could have been a patrol, or just goats with particularly aggressive attitudes. Egypt had no shortage of either. "Prepare the oil," barked a captain. The soldiers nearest the wall obeyed, though one of them whispered, "Why is it always oil? Can't we try boiling something pleasant, like date syrup?" No one answered that as the sun reached its zenith, reflecting harshly off bronze helmets and temple walls. The first arrows whistled through the air. One thudded into a wooden shield. With a satisfying another narrowly missed the town's sacred ibis, which squawked in protest and waddled off indignantly. Battle had begun. Again, before anyone had finished their second cup of beer-water. Still, there was a strange rhythm to it, all a terrible, familiar pattern. Egypt, after all, had been doing this for centuries. Raids and resistance, dust and destiny. Somewhere in the chaos, a soldier accidentally swung his sword at a reed bush and apologized. The bush didn't forgive him, and high above the clamor, a buzzard circled lazily, wondering if this was going to be another long afternoon of snacking opportunities. Back in the town, Horemhotep wrote quickly, capturing every absurdity and omen, every clash of shield and shout of courage. He knew that what happened next could be forgotten in generations, were carved in stone forever, depending, of course, on how much the pharaoh approved of the ending. And at that moment, standing under the weight of dust and sunlight, Horemhotep realized one thing with absolute certainty: he still hadn't eaten. The fighting lasted well into the evening, and by the time the last arrow fell, the southern fort stood battered but not broken. The raiders had retreated, slipping away like shadows before moonrise. Egypt had held the line again, though not without bruises and at least one chariot that now doubled as very expensive firewood. Word of the skirmish spread quickly. By the time Horemhotep returned to the capital with his notes and a sunburn in the shape of his scroll bag strap, the tale had already mutated. Some claimed the defenders had called lightning down from the heavens. Others insisted the raiders were giants with golden teeth. Someone even said the ibis had cursed the enemy, which Horemhotep did not write down, but probably should have. Back in Thebes, life marched on with a rhythm both eternal and stubborn. In the palace, Pharaoh Amos lounged in his perfumed chambers, sipping something imported and possibly alcoholic. As his advisors updated him on the battle, he listened with polite interest, occasionally raising an eyebrow like someone pretending to care during a very long dinner toast. "We pushed them back," the general reported. "Minimal losses, excellent morale." The pharaoh nodded slowly, and the grain, a pause, a cough, a reluctant glance at the floor. "Well, slightly trampled, your majesty. Have the scribes spin that differently?" Amos wasn't cruel, just deeply uninterested in unpleasant details. He had a kingdom to inspire and statues to commission. Bronze losses could be replaced. Wheat was a different matter. Outside the palace, the city buzzed with the usual mixture of commerce, gossip, and complaints about the heat. Vendors hawked their wares: linen, fish, amulets shaped like frogs, while children darted between donkey carts and shouted things that would probably get them cursed by at least 3 different gods. One particular corner of the city had become the unofficial gathering place for returning soldiers and curious citizens. The tavern, known locally as the Bent Reed, overflowed with stories, examinations, and a drink made from fermented figs that was banned in most temples for being too spiritual. Horemhotep sat at the edge of the crowd, scribbling down details with practiced ease. A soldier nearby demonstrated how he had deflected 10 arrows with one shield swipe, which would have been more convincing if his shield didn't still have 8 arrows sticking out of it. In the shadows behind the tavern, a quiet figure listened, a foreigner, wrapped in dyed linen, pretending to study the wall mural, while his ears caught every whispered tale. His name was lost to history, but his presence wasn't. He was one of many from lands east of the Nile, part trader, part spy, part man who had never paid for a drink in his life. Historians still argue whether foreign agents like him helped spark the next round of conflicts or merely watched them unfold with a smirk and a fruit basket. Elsewhere in the city, preparations were already underway for the inevitable retaliation. Egypt never let a raid go unanswered. Armories clanged with activity as bronze was sharpened and leather cured. A priestess prepared incantations for protection, some involving recited hymns, others involving what might have been cat fur and apricot pulp. A muralist was even commissioned to pre-paint the victory scene. "Just leave the enemy's face blank for now," the overseer said, tapping his chin. "We'll fill it in later." Meanwhile, far to the south, the retreating raiders regrouped. Their leader, a man known as Makari, paced among his warriors. He had sharp eyes, a sharper blade, and a distaste for Egyptian smugness that bordered on personal. "They're getting lazy," he told his second-in-command. "We'll strike again, and next time, we won't miss the grain." His second-in-command nodded, then hesitated. "The ibis cursed us." Makari stared. "Never say that again." Back in Thebes, life continued in its usual contradiction, half sacred, half absurd. At the temple of Karnak, priests prepared offerings, ringing tiny gold bells to summon favor from the gods. Down the street, a woman scolded her goat for eating her husband's sandals. The goat, unrepentant, bleated defiantly. That night, Horemhotep returned home, his scrolls now filled with first-hand accounts, half-truths, and one doodle of a crocodile wearing a crown. He read through his notes by oil lamp, frowning at the inconsistencies. In one version of the battle, the pharaoh himself had ridden in on a lion. In another, the enemy had been repelled by particularly aggressive bees. Both were probably wrong, but both were also somehow more fun, and that, he thought, might be the point. The next morning, official announcements were issued. Pharaoh Amon declared victory, praised the bravery of the troops, and casually mentioned that taxes would rise to ensure future triumphs. The last part didn't get cheers. Horemhotep was summoned to the palace to record the decree on papyrus. He arrived sweating and flustered, only to find the vizier had already rewritten half the speech to include a reference to divine favor, royal wisdom, and, oddly, the freshness of court-baked bread. Make it sound heroic, the vizier instructed, but also edible. Later that day, a small parade wound through the city. Children tossed petals, priests waved incense, and returning soldiers tried not to limp. One of them still had goose fat on his forehead from the blessing. It had not helped that, at the end of the line, a chariot rolled by, carrying the pharaohs. Doubler, very fit, very sun-kissed, stand-in with a glued-on beard. Amos preferred to avoid public heat waves. No one questioned it, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the city. The Nile reflected a kingdom both proud and precarious. Egypt had won for now, but war, like the flood, always returned. And, somewhere in the distance, under a foreign sky, Makari sharpened his blade and whispered to the wind, "Next time." By the time the flood season rolled in, most of Thebes had traded swords for sandals again, and the soldiers had either gone back to farming or trying to forget the smell of burnt leather. The Nile rose with its usual confidence, spilling over its banks as if it owned the place which, technically, it did. In Egypt, the river was less of a body of water and more of a divine personality. It fed the crops, transported gossip, and occasionally swallowed an ox cart, just to remind everyone who was in charge. Horemhotep stood near the banks one morning, watching as laborers waded knee-deep to set up the flood markers. These stone columns, dotted with lines and symbols, were supposed to predict how good the harvest would be. One priest claimed they could even foresee military outcomes. Horemhotep had his doubts, especially since that same priest also sold blessed beetles for insomnia. This year, the flood was generous. Fields glistened with promise. Scribes smiled. Farmers danced awkwardly in ankle-deep water. And, of course, the palace took credit for everything. Pharaoh Amos issued a decree. The gods were pleased. The nation was strong. And all complaints about past tax hikes were retroactively invalid. He even held a brief ceremony beside the river, tossing in a small gold statue as an offering. "Will the gods accept this gift?" someone asked. "They'd better," muttered the treasurer, eyeing the expensive splash. But prosperity, like fermented fish, didn't age well without storage. The abundance brought other problems, chief among them envy. Neighboring lands heard of Egypt's success and didn't exactly send congratulatory fruit baskets. Rumors of renewed raiding reached the southern fortresses, and military officials began sharpening their spears between grain shipments. Meanwhile, in the administrative halls of Thebes, things were chaotic in a very bureaucratic way. The surplus meant more inventory, more records, and more people suddenly claiming to be cousins of wheat inspectors. Horemhotep, buried under scrolls, tried to track it all. One shipment of barley went missing. Between Memphis and Abydos, 2 oxen were caught wearing each other's ownership brands, and someone had forged a grain requisition form using blue ink which, unfortunately, hadn't even been invented yet. Historians still argue whether this blue ink scandal was an inside job or simply the work of an ambitious goatherder, with poor penmanship. In the countryside, farmers worked from sunrise to starlight. They used wooden plows pulled by oxen with names like Snorter and Bad Attitude. Children scattered seeds while elders sang hymns to Hopi, the flood god, in voices that were part reverent, part flat-out off-key. And while everyone focused on the land, few noticed the quiet arrival of foreign traders at the ports. They came from Nubia, Canaan, and other names half lost to time, offering incense, copper, exotic birds, and information. Lots of information. One particularly sharp-eyed merchant A woman named Atara brought with her stories of shifting alliances and rising powers beyond the eastern borders. War is like perfume, she told a palace guard with a wink. Too much of it, and everyone gets dizzy. Back at court, Pharaoh Amos prepared for a different kind of battle. Politics. A few of his advisors had grown too comfortable, others too bold. One even dared suggest expanding irrigation without first consulting that man was promptly reassigned to field consultation. In a village, where the most exciting thing was a chicken that cackled every time someone sneezed, to distract from dissent, Amos ordered a grand festival. It would celebrate the Nile, the harvest, and, coincidentally, his divine ability to select really good wine. The festival preparations were as chaotic as a hippo in a sandal shop. Tents were raised, dancers rehearsed, bakers shaped loaves into symbols of prosperity, mostly crocodiles and papyrus flowers, though one bold baker created a likeness of the pharaoh's nose, which was confiscated for security reasons. Horemhotep was tasked with scripting the ceremonial proclamation. Make it sound majestic, the vizier said, but also relatable. Use the word eternal at least 4 times. He sighed and got to work, trying to rhyme something with Nile that wasn't crocodile. When the festival finally arrived, Thebes gleamed, torches lit up the temple facades, music drifted through the air like sweet smoke. Children wore red crowns and tried to barter for extra honeycakes, with promises of eternal loyalty. It worked once. Pharaoh Amos arrived in full regalia, flanked by guards who looked about as festive as bricks. He gave a short speech, mostly about divine favor and not at all about tax levies, and raised a goblet to thunderous applause. That night, even the most skeptical villagers danced beneath stars older than their ancestors, and the Nile shimmered, as if winking at their joy. But joy is a fragile thing. South of the border, Makari was still watching. He had heard of the flood, the grain, the laughter. He had spies of his own, some dressed as traders, others as musicians, one possibly as a particularly charming goat, and he was planning. His map, etched onto leather, showed weak points in Egypt's defenses. The gaps were small, but to a man like Makari, small gaps were just big enough. As the festivities in Thebes peaked, a single torch flickered on the southern horizon, just a spark, a warning, a whisper of war wrapped in smoke. Back in his chamber, Horemhotep looked up from his writing. Something in the air had shifted like the pause before thunder. The Nile flowed on, steady and oblivious, but not everyone slept peacefully. The breeze that swept over Thebes the next morning smelled of barley, charcoal, and trouble. At dawn, Horemhotep found himself summoned to the central hall by a courier who looked like he'd been running since last year. The scroll he carried was sealed with an unfamiliar mark, an eagle, surrounded by jagged lines. Not Egyptian, not friendly. By the time the sun had lifted above the palm trees, Pharaoh Amos and his senior council had gathered around the granite table in the war chamber, each of them pretending not to notice the other's nervous glances. The message was brief, and worse, poetic. To the land of flood and stone, we come not as traders, but as the tide that leaves no grain behind. Well, muttered the general, at least they're literate. The message had come from the south. Makari was on the move. Scouts had confirmed his presence near the third cataract of the Nile, too close for comfort, and too far for a quick interception. His forces, a patchwork of Nubian warriors, desert riders, and a few suspiciously well-fed mercenaries, had already taken 3 small outposts and disrupted vital supply lines. And worse, he was using boats. Egyptians liked their boats. They were flat-bottomed, dependable, and mostly involved in trade, ceremonies, or fishing. But to see foreign warriors mastering the river, that felt wrong, like someone teaching a camel how to dance, while the court bickered over defense strategies. Horemhotep slipped out to the archives. He wasn't a soldier, but he knew that knowledge could tip scales sharper than swords. He dug through dusty scrolls and weathered maps, searching for forgotten fortifications, old alliances, and any reference to Makari's last known patterns. He found something odd. About 50 years earlier, another tribal leader had attempted a similar incursion along the Nile. The records described his tactics: fast boat raids, unexpected nighttime attacks, and an uncanny ability to vanish into the marshes. That campaign ended not with swords, but with disease. Mosquitoes had done what warriors could not. Horemhotep tucked the scroll under his arm and made a mental note: alert the priest-physicians, and check the reed swamps for vulnerabilities. But outside the library, things were accelerating. Ahmose had sent a message to the Temple of Omenra requesting divine guidance. This meant a week-long ritual involving fasting, chanting, and the sacrificing of a particularly grumpy ox. The priests agreed reluctantly then reminded the pharaoh that the gods did not take sides, not publicly. Anyway, at the southern garrison's troops were mobilizing. Young men barely past their first shave were handed spears and told to trust their ancestors. Veterans muttered about another sandstorm war and packed extra sandals. Thebes itself was preparing, not just for war, but for uncertainty. Markets buzzed with rumors. Someone claimed Makari could speak to crocodiles. Another swore he'd seen a hawk flying backwards, definite sign of doom. If you asked old Nenu, the beekeeper, amid the tension, Pharaoh Amos gave a rousing speech. Atop the temple steps, he spoke of unity, legacy, and the divine protection of Egypt. He even quoted a sacred poem, though some suspected he made up the last few lines for dramatic effect. And we shall stand, as the obelisks stand tall, unbroken, and covered in really expensive hieroglyphs. The crowd laughed. A little. One odd moment stood out though. During the speech, a cloaked figure in the audience whispered a phrase that startled Horemhotep. The river has two faces. He turned, but the speaker vanished before he could question them. Later, he would scribble that phrase onto a clay shard and keep it in his satchel, for reasons he didn't quite understand. Meanwhile, on the southern frontier, Captain Menkaure, kind of man who used his shield as a plate, and his enemies as anecdotes, was organizing defenses. He'd once single-handedly defended a watchtower by throwing pottery at invaders until they mistook him for a demon. Now, he stood knee-deep in river mud, pointing at maps with a spear and barking orders. Reinforced the west bank. No, not that west, your west. His scouts reported strange sightings, figures on hilltops, fire signals at odd hours, and once, a line of birds flying in a perfect V that turned into an X-omens. One soldier whispered, "Pigeons," Menka replied, swatting at mosquitoes. Back in Thebes, the river glowed gold under a setting sun, indifferent to the growing tension. Children still played along the banks, tossing pebbles and daring one another to touch the water's edge. They didn't know about war. Not yet. In the palace garden, Horemhotep met secretly with Atara the merchant, with too many secrets and not enough patience. "I hear Makari has a map of his own," she said, sipping date wine. "It's not inked, it's sung." "What does that even mean?" he asked. "He's teaching his warriors using chants, landmarks, distances, enemy routes, all set to rhythm like a song you march to." Horemhotep blinked. "That's either genius or completely insane." "Both," Atara smirked. "The best strategies usually are." Historians still debate whether Makari's marching song was a real tactic or just a legend, but accounts from captured scouts years later mention verses describing Nile curves, fortress gaps, and how to row without splashing. By nightfall, Thebes lit its torches, not for celebration, but for vigilance. The mood had shifted. War drums sounded from somewhere beyond the hills, not loud, but persistent, like a heartbeat getting closer. At the river's edge, a single papyrus boat drifted ashore, empty. Inside it, a reed bundle wrapped in crimson thread. A warning. The next day, nothing would be the same. Dawn arrived like a whisper that morning. Sops pink skies, brushing the tops of Thebes' limestone walls, the Nile smooth as polished obsidian. But underneath that calm shimmer, Egypt had begun to brace for its pulse to change. Southward, just past the third cataract, Makari's fleet was moving faster than anyone expected. Instead of traditional troop columns along the riverbanks, he had ordered his warriors into canoes, reed rafts, and slender longboats, strange vessels with high bows painted like vultures. They didn't carry banners, they didn't chant, they rode in eerie silence, oars dipping like the limbs of insects. When Horemhotep heard the first reports, he raised a brow and muttered, "Boats don't creep." But apparently, these do. Egypt's navy was hastily mobilized, not a full navy in the traditional sense, more like a collection of cargo vessels with upgraded bravado. Many of their captains had never seen combat, unless you counted arguing over port taxes. In the harbors of Thebes, carpenters rushed to retrofit ships, with protective planks, turning wine barges into war. Smiths hammered bronze-tipped spears beside piles of garlic to ward off disease or crocodiles. whichever bites first, as one of them explained. Meanwhile, Pharaoh Amos received word from a minor priesthood near Elephantine Makari's troops had bypassed 2 Nile forts under the cover of night, using backwater channels. This was not just fast, it was surgical. To put it bluntly, he wasn't acting like a tribal chieftain, he was thinking like a general. Stranger still, scouts reported symbols etched into the bark of riverside, acacia trees, simple spirals, wave-like zigzags, and 3-dot clusters. When asked, one frightened villager whispered, "He marks where the Nile listens to him." Back at the war chamber, maps were unfurled. Thebes was no longer simply the capital. It was now the final threshold. Every general, advisor, and bearded astrologer had an opinion. The astrologer suggested aligning defenses with Sirius rising. Amos deadpanned, "Do the stars row boats now?" Enter the backup plan. Horemhotep had located an old but strategic holding point Fort Jetua, small, crumbling outpost perched on a bluff overlooking a narrow stretch of the river, abandoned for decades due to a spider infestation the size of melons. As legends claimed, it was now scrubbed, repainted, and heroically reoccupied by soldiers who didn't read the old scrolls too carefully. It was at Fort Jetu that something unexpected happened. One evening, as soldiers reinforced the ramparts, a curious traveler approached under a banner of truce. She introduced herself as Marianne, interpreter from the river tribes, and claimed she'd defected from Makari's camp. She had stories, plenty of them. Apparently, Makari was not building an empire, he was reclaiming one. According to his followers, their ancestors had ruled parts of southern Egypt long before pharaohs kept records. And now, with the gods silent and the Nile divided, he believed it was time for the waters to choose anew. "And what exactly does that mean?" Horemhotep asked her. Mari shrugged. "He believes the river favors the bold." The loud, he muttered. Whether she was telling the truth or spinning stories for protection remained unclear, but something about her gaze, steady, observant, suggested she'd seen more than any scroll would reveal. Meanwhile, tensions flared. Within Thebes, some high-ranking nobles argued to open negotiations, others insisted on a preemptive strike. One general even suggested flooding the marshlands to trap Makari's boats, until someone reminded him that they lived next to those marshlands. Amid this chaos, word arrived from a small fishing village near the 5th nome. Gone, burned. Not raided, not looted, erased. Charcoal and silence were all that remained. There were no bodies, either mercy, said Captain Menka, or something worse. Rumors spread like wildfire. Makari had a spear that could strike lightning. Makari could breathe underwater. Makari wasn't a man at all, but a forgotten god wearing human skin. To calm the people, the priests held open-air rituals invoking Sobek, the crocodile god of protection and rivers. They paraded sacred relics through the streets, splashing water and chanting until the crowds felt slightly safer, or slightly damp. And then came the eclipse. It was unannounced, unpredicted, and far too well timed. The sky darkened at midday, casting a ghostly hue over Thebes. Birds fell silent. Torches were lit. In the sudden half-darkness, someone shouted, "The Nile turns its face." It was Mari who said quietly, "He knew it would happen." When questioned, she explained that Makari's priests followed a different calendar lunar, not solar, and they had anticipated the event as a sign of ascension. For Egypt, it was a sign of alarm. Pharaoh Amos took no more chances. All reserves were summoned. Archers lined the banks. Water levels were measured obsessively. Some believed the river might rise unnaturally, either by Makari's hand or the gods. Spoiler, it didn't. But the frogs did get very loud that night. Even amid all this, life crept forward. In Thebes, bakers still kneaded dough, scribes still copied hymns, and street dogs still barked at absolutely nothing in the distance. But the people no longer slept easily. One strange detail caught Horemhotep's attention. An old scribe in the temple archives mentioned that during a war, centuries ago, an invading army vanished near the same river bend Makari now approached. No battle, no records, just gone. Historians still argue, the scribe said, whether it was a tactical error, divine intervention, or just ... the river swallowing them. That phrase returned again. The river has two faces. It echoed in Horemhotep's mind as he prepared to journey south, toward the bluff, the boats, and the battle no one wanted to name. As the section ended, The Nile remained combat under its surface. Something shifted. By the 6th morning, Thebes was different. The market squares still bustled, but no one haggled over lentils or linen anymore. Instead, whispers clung to the stone wall stalk of omens, of black sails on the southern horizon, of fish swimming upstream in tight circles, as if confused by the current. Even the cats seemed jumpier, and Egyptian cats don't get jumpy without a reason. At the palace, Pharaoh Amos had stopped wearing his ceremonial beard. "No time for vanity," he muttered, pacing beneath pillars carved with tales of older victories, none of which involved someone like Makari, and down by Fort Jetu. The air was tight with anticipation. Horemhotep and his men had fortified the bluff's edge with clever traps, narrow ditches disguised by reeds, clusters of thorned acacia sharpened and bound like defensive hedgehogs, and even a row of oil-filled amphorae ready to be lit and hurled onto rivercraft below. If Makari wanted to glide past unnoticed, he'd need more than ghostly oars. It was then that Mari the defector, who may or may not have been telling the whole truth, asked for a quiet moment with Horemhotep. "I've seen what he's building," she said, her voice low but urgent. "It's not an army. It's a story. One he wants everyone to believe in before the fight even begins." He raised an eyebrow. "Stories don't bleed." She paused. "But people will, for them." Mari explained that Makari had begun reciting the river's tale to his followers, a creation myth, rewritten, in which his people were the Nile's firstborn, that Egypt's pharaohs had taken the river for themselves, bending its will, building unnatural dams and cities. "He says we should return to the flow." "Return to the flow," Horemhotep repeated. "Does he hand out papyrus pamphlets?" With that, she didn't laugh. Instead, she mentioned something stranger. Makari's last encampment, she said, had no tents, just rows of men sitting in circles at night, whispering a chant that rose and fell like water lapping on stone. No fire preparation, no idle chatter. It was as if they weren't a war band, but a ritual. The army wasn't just being fed, it was being transformed. Horemhotep didn't say it out loud, but he felt it too. A kind of pressure in the chest whenever Makari was mentioned, like standing near the edge of a waterfall, unseen but unmistakably there. That evening, the Nile fog came early. From the top of the bluff, soldiers strained their eyes. A distant cluster of dark shapes bobbed low on the water, not ships exactly, more like floating islands, tied together by planks and cloaked in woven mats. The first arrows were loosed by instinct. They vanished into mist. Then the singing began, not loud, not in unison, but in waves. Low male voices humming a pattern of vowels. That sounded more like river sounds than language. One archer dropped his bow. "What is that?" someone asked. No one answered. The floating shapes drifted closer. They made no effort to speed up or retreat. They just kept gliding, fog clinging to their flanks like robes. Then, just before sunset, the lead raft paused. A single figure stepped forward. It was Makari. It was a boy, perhaps 12, thin, bare-chested, wearing nothing but a reed belt and a string of blue amulets. He raised his hands, not in surrender, not in threat, just ... open ... A ripple passed through the defenders. "Is this a trick?" one captain muttered. Horemhotep said nothing. The boy placed a jar, small, dark, sealed with wax, on the edge of the raft and stepped back. Then all the vessels retreated, vanishing into fog as quickly as they had come. No one slept that night, not because of fear, but because of that jar. It was brought up to the command tent. Every scribe, priest, and curious soldier gathered around as Horemhotep broke the seal. Inside, they found a scroll, tightly rolled, and a single lotus petal still fresh. The scroll was short, just a few lines in old hieratic script. It read, "When the Nile was young, it chose freely. Now it is shackled with names and borders, but the water still remembers. Meet us where the cliffs divide." No signature, just a drawn symbol at the bottom, 3 lines branching from a circle. It looked eerily like a root system, or a river delta. Historians still argue whether this was a threat, an invitation, or a riddle. Some even claim the lotus petal was a rare kind, extinct by that period, suggesting someone or something was playing a longer game than mere war. Pharaoh Amos, upon hearing of the encounter, grew unusually quiet. He ordered his royal cartouche to be carved into a fresh stela, beside the temple of Khonsu, not to celebrate victory, but in case someone needs to remember us, he said with a wan smile. Meanwhile, Horemhotep began drafting a maneuver. If Makari wanted to speak in riddles, Egypt would respond with formations. He dispatched 3 scouts to the cliffs south of Jetu, where the Nile narrowed into jagged rocks and split briefly into 2 streams before rejoining. It was a place feared by boatman. Currents swirled unpredictably, crocodiles nested nearby, and voices echoed. Strangely, one scout returned. He claimed he saw a figure standing alone atop the middle rock between the splits. Longstaff, bird feather, cloak, face hidden in shadow. Watching the river, did he speak? They asked. No, said the scout, but I swear the river slowed around him. Nobody believed it, but nobody dismissed it either. And so, Egypt waited. Pharaohs don't usually attend strategy sessions in person, but Amos did. He stood beside Horemhotep at dawn, both watching the river shift under a veil of mist, knowing full well that the next move might define the memory of their reign, and still the fog thickened. The day of the parley arrived like a whisper rather than a roar. Mist clung to every surface, as if the Nile had decided to hold its breath. Down by the cliffs of Division, where the river split around a knuckle of jagged stone before rejoining, itself like a second thought, Egypt's delegation waited. Pharaoh Amos, dressed in ceremonial white linen threaded with gold, stood beneath a canopy of woven reeds. He had brought no fan-bearers, no scribes, no guards, save 2 twin brothers, Janfa and Wee, famed for never having lost a duel nor spoken more than 7 words a day. Horemhotep stood to the pharaoh's left, arms crossed, brow locked in, a permanent state of skepticism. You'd think he'll come? Asked the pharaoh, not turning. Horemhotep scanned the fog. If not, he'll at least watch. This feels like one of those show you're not afraid things. The pharaoh chuckled, dryly. Let's hope that's all it is. I'd hate to get stabbed for the sake of theater. Then the river moved, not in a surge but a graceful pull, like silk being drawn across the floor. A single craft appeared, no oars, no sail, just a flat raft of dark wood. At its center stood a tall figure cloaked in what looked like reeds and owl feathers, face obscured by a veil of woven papyrus. He looked more like a ghost than a warlord. Makari. No introduction, no herald. The raft stopped precisely 10 paces from the bank. You've been busy, Amos said, arms behind his back. Makari didn't speak immediately. He tilted his head slightly as if listening to the water. Then, you've been forgetting. Pharaoh raised an eyebrow. Forgetting? The Nile. Its memory stretches farther than your scribe's record, farther than your pyramid's reach. We're just now remembering what it whispered to us. Behind the pharaoh, Horemhotep resisted the urge to roll his eyes. What is it you want? Amos asked plainly. To unbuild what was built wrong, said to let the river breathe again. He gestured toward the split cliffs. These stones, he shaped them with fire centuries ago to change the current. Now fish die upstream. Fields rot downstream. The balance is broken. Amos frowned. You call this war over fish? Makari smiled not warmly. Fish are the beginning, he said. So are border markers. So are stone tablets that say mine when the Nile never said yours. A silence stretched. Horemhotep leaned in, toward the pharaoh. This isn't a negotiation. It's a sermon. Then Makari pulled something from beneath his cloak. A small statue. Worn it resembled Hopi, the Nile god of inundation, except the face was blank, uncarved as if waiting. He held it out. This, he said, was found buried beside one of your earliest temples, wrapped in reeds, placed in a child's coffin. No name, no offering, just waterweed in its mouth. Amos glanced at it, then at Makari. And we have unearthed what you forgot, Makari said softly, and we are ready to return it to the river. That's when the odd thing happened. A flock of ibises, silent until now, rose from the cliffs behind, circling 3 times above the split river before vanishing northward. Even Horemhotep, hardened as he was, felt a tickle up his spine. Let's suppose, Amos said cautiously, I dismantle the river wall edge, too. Lift taxes on southern traders. Open the temples to your priests. Will that satisfy your memory? Makari looked down. No, you've already built the dream. Now you must wake from it. And with that, he let the little statue fall into the river. No splash, just a soft plunk, followed by ripples that extended all the way to the raft. Then you leave me no choice, Amos said, voice colder. No, Makari replied. I give you one. The raft began drifting backward, not turning, just gliding silently into mist, as if tugged by thought. As it disappeared, Horemhotep exhaled sharply. "He's not going to stop." "No," said the pharaoh. "He wants to unright the Nile." Back at the camp that night, soldiers began readying the fleet. Oil was poured into sealed jars. Shields were scraped clean of grime. And the crocodile handlers, yes, Egypt had those were summoned to guard the banks from below. Because tomorrow, the pharaoh would ride south. He wouldn't wait for Makari to finish his sermon. But that evening, under the cover of twilight, something strange happened. A child appeared at the edge of the camp, no older than 6. Mute, barefoot, skin darkened by sun and river water. She carried a folded piece of linen. When the guards approached, she didn't run. She held out the cloth and pointed to the Nile. Inside the cloth, a single black ibis feather, and a knot of reeds twisted into the shape of a broken eye. No message, no name, just a symbol, one that scholars would later argue had not been seen since the reign of King Den, centuries before. An older warning, or perhaps a curse. "We should burn it," Horemhotep muttered, but the pharaoh said no. He placed it beside his bed, saying, "If the river wants to speak, I'll listen." For a man preparing for battle, that was either very brave or very tired. That night, intense from general to foot soldier, no one really slept. Some claimed the river had begun humming. Others said they dreamt of being pulled under water, not by hands, but by stories. Even the crocodiles kept their distance from the banks. Egypt was on the verge of a war it didn't fully understand, and the river was remembering. When Pharaoh Amos gave the order to march south, it wasn't with a roar but a quiet hand gesture, like he was brushing sand off a scroll. The army moved at dawn, a long ripple of bronze and linen sliding down the banks of the Nile. Cricked, the sun bounced off shields like tiny suns of their own, and the war drums beat low and slow, as if trying not to wake something older than men. "Are we really doing this?" muttered a young spearman to his friend as they trudged beside a supply barge. "Going to war with a ghost in a feather mask." His friend shrugged. "Better than collecting taxes in Upper Memphis." But behind their jokes was annoying unease. Even the pharaoh's standard-bearer, usually a beacon of swagger, carried the royal flag with less conviction. The emblem, a golden falcon, seemed oddly subdued against the morning haze. The plan was simple on papyrus, less so in sand and sweat. Makari's main camp had been sited near the ruins of Pahaku, a long-abandoned temple complex swallowed by marsh and vine. The pharaoh's strategy: encircle from both land and river, corner them, cut off supply, end this before the heat of midsummer baked everyone's brains. But Pahaku was no ordinary battleground. As they approached, scouts reported strange things: fires that didn't burn wood but glowed over water, figures seen at dusk that vanished when approached, markings drawn in fish blood on palm leaves and tied to floating stones. Even the royal cartographer gave up trying to map the approach, saying the terrain changed when you blinked. Horemhotep wasn't impressed. "Marsh tricks," he growled, snapping a reed underfoot. "Give me a torch and a squad of men who don't scare easy, and I'll bring back his head in a basket." The pharaoh didn't reply. He just kept walking. By midday, the fleet of papyrus-reinforced boats had flanked the southern inlet. Troops on foot moved through the dry rise to the north, where vultures circled lazily above a canopy of strangler fig. That's when the first oddity occurred. A soldier named Kebi, who'd been sent ahead to mark a campsite, returned looking damp, except he hadn't crossed the water, and not just damp-soaked. His tunic, his hair, even the insides of his boots. He dripped as if he'd waded through the Nile. "I didn't see anything," he kept saying. "It just found me." They tried to wring an explanation from him. He kept whispering, "I heard singing." But from the roots, they posted him at the rear and carried on. By dusk, the army reached the perimeter of Pahaku. A more superstitious general might have paused. A more practical one would have waited till morning. Amos ordered the attack at sunset. They moved swiftly, splitting their formation into river-borne archers and ground infantry. Torches were lit, drums were silenced, and crocodile handlers stayed close, though none of the beasts had been seen since noon. And yet, there were no enemy scouts, no sentries, no resistance, just the ruins. Tumbled columns half swallowed by vines, hollowed-out holes lined with faded inscriptions. Statues of forgotten gods with long teeth and too many arms half buried in mud. They advanced into the temple complex, and then, silence. Not the kind that means peace, but the kind before something large moves. Torches flickered. One went out, then two. A wind not cold, but heavy passed through, and that's when they saw them. Not soldiers, not warriors. Figures in veils, drifting between pillars, too tall, too slow. Their feet didn't move. Their arms were crossed over their chests, like mummies refusing to lie still. And behind them, just for a second, a flicker of a larger shape. Round head, narrow shoulders, a mask made of ibis feathers and clay. Makari. But before they could react, the mist thickened. The soldiers fought nothing. They struck at shadows, fired arrows into the fog, swung blades through empty air. Only Horemhotep, grim as ever, kept his men grounded. Fall back, he barked. They want confusion. Deny them the pleasure. They regrouped at the outer courtyard, dragging the wounded, though oddly, there were few injuries. Just panic, disorientation, and those who returned spoke of strange things. One saw a child made of reeds whispering in his ear. Another claimed the river rose through the floor and tried to pull him into the stone. One poor man stood still for an hour, murmuring, "My name isn't mine anymore." Later, priests examined him and claimed his bar the part of the soul tied to personal identity. Metav wondered. Historians still argue whether this event was merely mass confusion in difficult terrain, or something else. That night, Pharaoh Amos convened his captains. Horemhotep argued for fire burn the ruins, flush them out. Others urged retreat, but the pharaoh was oddly calm. He turned to the linen-wrapped bundle beside his bed, the same one from the child messenger. He untied it, looked at the feather and the knot again. "Maybe," he said quietly, "we've already lost something." "Not yet," Horemhotep growled. "Not until they make me kneel." There was one last development that night. In the stillest hour, when even frogs dared not croak, the wind returned, and on its back came a sound, a horn, deep, hollow, not a call to war, but to remembrance. It came from the heart of the ruins, and then it stopped. The pharaoh did not sleep that night, nor did his men. Only the river moved, whispering round the stone feet of gods long since drowned. By morning, the swampy light over Perhaku turned gold, not the triumphant kind, but the brittle shimmer of old coins left in the sun too long. Pharaoh Amos stood in the doorway of his command tent, watching dragonflies skitter over the waterlogged earth. He looked less like a ruler now, and more like a man waiting for something to make sense. Behind him, a priest of Thoth was burning incense and muttering protective verses that, frankly, sounded more like apologies. "I thought this was a war," Amos finally muttered. "It is," Horemhotep said behind him, arms folded like a wall. "But maybe they picked the wrong battlefield." That day, the army didn't attack. Instead, Amos ordered a slow sweep, not to conquer, but to observe. Historians have debated ever since if this was a sign of strategic brilliance or simple hesitation. The truth is probably both. Small squads entered the outskirts of the ruins, accompanied by scribes and record keepers. They were tasked not with fighting, but with looking, and what they found was unsettling. The temple had rooms where time seemed wrong. In one chamber, an oil lamp left burning the night before still flickered its wax unmelted. In another, plants that had been trampled during the previous night's confusion stood tall again, as if regrown overnight. A set of footprints was discovered, bare, narrow, and continuous. They led straight into a stone wall with no door. The scribes took notes feverishly, but by midday, 3 of them had quit their duties entirely and were seen sketching spirals in the dirt with their fingers, eyes glassy. That afternoon, Amos ordered the Hall of Stones cleared, an open courtyard where statues of ancient local gods had crumbled into piles over centuries. The plan was simple: burn incense, call on the state gods for protection, and formally reclaim the place. In the name of the crown. What followed was less simple. The moment the royal standard was raised in the courtyard, a cry rang out, not from human throat, but from above. A long, low call, like an ibis drowning under water, and the air changed. Birds dropped from the sky, dozens of them falling like tossed grain, not dead, just stunned. One charioteer tried to make light of it. "Maybe they just don't like flags." No one laughed. Then, from the corner of the courtyard, a figure stepped forward. It wasn't Makari, it was an old woman, dressed in rags and palm fronds, eyes hidden beneath a mask of smeared ochre. She walked barefoot across the broken stone, untouched by the heat. She didn't speak. She simply held out both arms, palms up, revealing a pair of offerings, a beetle, carved from bone, and a stone shaped like a tooth. And then she vanished. No smoke, no flash, just gone between one blink and the next. Now, that could have been the end of it. A vision, a trick. But hours later, both the beetle and the tooth were discovered in the pharaoh's tent, lying on his breakfast tray. At this point, the royal physicians were recommending very long naps for everyone involved. But the pharaoh, he stared at the objects for a while, then nodded. "This is a message," he said. "No offense, my king," Horemhotep muttered, "but so is a sword." Still, Ahmose didn't counterattack. He sent a delegation instead, 3 priests of Ptah, 1 military diplomat, and an interpreter who didn't even believe in curses. They went into the ruins at twilight. Only the interpreter came back. He was smiling when they found him, sitting cross-legged on a rock, covered in strange powders. His skin sparkled faintly under torchlight, like mica dust. They said no. He said simply, "To what?" asked Horemhotep. "To everything." Then he passed out for 2 days. It was clear, now, that the war had changed shape. The soldiers no longer spoke of battle tactics or flanking maneuvers. They spoke of dreams. One man dreamed he was swimming in the Nile, but the water had teeth. Another woke up with sand in his mouth and hieroglyphs carved into his fingernails. One captain claimed he saw a woman standing at the edge of camp each night, holding a jar filled with stars. Even Horemhotep, who'd once punched a priest in the jaw for talking about omens, admitted to seeing his dead brother twice in broad daylight. The pharaoh took it all in stride. He began visiting the edge of the ruins each evening, not with guards, but with offerings, bread, beer, perfumes, old stories. A ritual emerged. He would sit, place the beetle and the tooth on a mat, and speak aloud, not commands, not threats, but tales of his youth, of his fears, of his father's failures. And every morning, the items were arranged differently. Some took this as madness, others as negotiation. One night, the pharaoh returned with a new scar, 3 shallow cuts on his left forearm. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The army knew now. This was no longer about land, or rebellion, or even Makari. This was about memory. The ruins were remembering too much, and maybe, just maybe, they were choosing what to forget. Historians still argue whether the Ghost War was ever truly a war. No battles were won. No cities fell. No treaties signed. But what followed in the next days would ripple through Egypt for generations. It began with the burial, not of a man, but of a name. In a field outside Perhaku, under a fig tree, the pharaoh ordered a small tomb built. Inside, he placed 3 things: the beetle, the tooth, and a mask made of ibis feathers and clay. He had never seen Makari's face, but he buried it all the same. And the fog, at last, began to lift. The birds flew again. The water calmed, and for the first time in weeks, the soldiers dreamed only of sleep. The war was over. Well, sort of. Pharaoh Ahmose didn't return to Thebes in triumph, chest out, arms raised, like some conquering hero from the wall paintings. No golden parade, no speech carved in limestone for future scribes to overanalyze. Instead, he returned quietly. Just him, a few wagons, a tired army, and a story no one really wanted to write down. Back in the capital, courtiers greeted him with stiff smiles and thinly veiled confusion. Victory, they whispered, or retreat. But the pharaoh simply nodded, handed off the reins of his chariot, and asked for a bath drawn with cedar oil in silence. In the following days, he called together his advisors, and then he did something that, frankly, confused everyone. He ordered a festival, a real one, too. Not a somber ritual with black incense and crocodile skulls, but a proper flower-drenched, flute-heavy, street-blocking kind of party, to honor the dead. One priest asked. "No," said Ahmose, "to honor forgetting." That night, the city pulsed with noise. Dancers twirled in saffron robes, and even the temple guards cracked a smile or two. Bread flowed like water. Beer, unfortunately, also flowed like water at one point. Someone painted a beetle and a tooth on a wall and labeled it "the things we don't talk about." Ahmose saw it, chuckled, and left it untouched. But even as joy spilled through Thebes, strange things began to trickle back in with the breeze. A caravan from the south arrived with stories of a lake that vanished overnight, just gone, replaced by a field of black feathers. A papyrus merchant reported receiving a sealed scroll with no writing on it, yet he claimed it whispered when unrolled. And one morning, a group of children discovered a small clay statue outside the palace, gate-shaped like a jackal, holding a mirror. No one had placed it there. At first, people chalked these things up to post-war jitters. The mind plays tricks, especially when it's tired of not knowing. But by the time a priestess of Hathor found her ceremonial wig braided with ibis feathers, things were getting harder to ignore. Imos, for his part, seemed ... He took to walking alone in the palace garden late at night, barefoot on the cool limestone paths, speaking aloud to no one. The servants pretended not to hear him. "It's not a curse," he said once, to the moon. "It's a conversation." One historian much later wrote that Ahmose had gone gently mad, but another claimed he had become Egypt's first listener pharaoh, a man who knew when silence was the only answer. Whichever version you prefer, this much is fact. The pharaoh began building something, a small temple, not in the main district, not even near the Nile. It rose slowly in the desert fringe, shaped like no other temple in Egypt. Its layout formed a spiral, not a square. There were no statues, no columns, only walls etched with abstract symbols, circles, waves, bird tracks. When asked what it was for, Ahmose said simply, "To remember how to forget." And here's the thing: people started visiting, not in droves, just a few, pilgrims of the strange. Some came hoping to dream better, others came seeking answers. Some just wandered in because the desert told them to. One man swore he walked inside and saw his mother's cooking pot floating mid-air, gently steaming. He cried and left. Another woman claimed she lost her shadow inside the third chamber, came back a week later, found it waiting outside, looking annoyed. The temple gained a name, Pernecha, Amunet, the Hidden One's house. No priest ever served there, no festivals ever honored it, and yet someone always seemed to be sweeping its entrance. Meanwhile, rumors about Makari still flickered like candlelight. Some said she had been seen sailing down the Nile, alone in a reed boat, eyes closed, hands in her lap, surrounded by whispering birds. Others swore she'd dissolved entirely, become part of the wind in Upper Egypt, stealing secrets from careless mouths. A farmer in Esna claimed his daughter had spoken to a woman made of rain, who taught her how to tell time using only shadows and bird calls. That's the thing about legends, they echo in odd places. Back in the court, Ahmose's advisors tried their best to steer things toward normalcy. They redrew borders, restored taxes, repainted old gods. But the people, they didn't forget. Not entirely. Children started playing games where they took turns pretending to vanish, like Makari. The game always ended when someone cried. Fishermen on the Nile offered tiny breadcrumbs to the river at sunset, in case something listens beneath. And scribes began adding blank pages to the end of scrolls, for whatever we've missed. They said, even Pharaoh Ahmose took to writing dreams down on bits of linen, then burying them under fig trees. It became a quiet ritual in Thebes. If you had a dream too strange to speak of, you found a tree and whispered it into the roots. Eventually, the roots grew wise, and the final oddity, well, one morning, years after all this, a low-ranking guard patrolling the ruins of Perhakao stumbled upon a wall with fresh carvings. The carvings weren't in hieroglyphs, they were pictograms. One showed a woman holding a beetle and a tooth, another showed a spiral, with a single star in the middle, and at the bottom, a child holding a mirror, with no reflection. The guard stared for a long time, then walked away without reporting it. Later that year, he planted a fig tree in his backyard, and never spoke of it again. The story didn't end, but it did soften. In the years that followed, Egypt tiptoed back into its routines. The Nile still flooded, markets buzzed, offerings still smoldered at dawn, but a quiet shift had slipped in, like silt settling beneath clear water. Pharaoh Ahmose aged gracefully, his hair graying at the temples, his voice deeper but slower, as if each word weighed a little more than it used to. He stopped attending council meetings as often, spent longer hours in the garden, occasionally asked palace scribes to read him dreams submitted by strangers. "I want to know what keeps them awake," he'd say, eyes half closed, and in those dreams he heard something odd, a pattern, not in the stories themselves. Those were wild as always. Flying crocodiles, sandals that sang, rivers that flowed upward. No, the pattern was in what wasn't being said. Each dream paused, hesitated, skipped like a broken pot rim right when it reached something too big, too strange, as if Egypt's people had collectively agreed not to say the thing out loud. But what was the thing? That question festered in quiet corners, and just when it seemed Egypt had settled into its new rhythm, the desert did what it always does when humans pretend they're in charge. It laughed. One night, the moon vanished, not behind clouds, not during an eclipse. It simply didn't show up. The sky held stars. The air was still. But where the moon should have been, there was only a smudge of faint shimmer, like oil on linen. The priests panicked. Torches were lit in every temple. Goats were blamed. But the strangest thing, no animals made a sound. Not the ibis, not the jackals, not even the beetles, who normally click and scratch through the warm dark dot. It lasted one night. Then the moon returned, rising the next evening as if nothing had happened. But people noticed something had changed. A shepherd near Memphis claimed his sheep refused to look up at the sky ever again. In Thebes, a group of scribes began drawing spirals into the margins of every new scroll or tapestry, unconsciously. One artisan created a mirror that only showed your face if you whispered your birth name into it backward. Pharaohs took notice. He ordered no investigations, no explanations. Instead, he summoned a small group of children from various towns. Each had been reported for saying things they shouldn't know. One had described the layout of a lost temple. Another could name all of Makari's servants who were never recorded. One boy drew a picture of a beetle balancing on the back of a jackal, captioned, "The witnesses." Amos sat with them, gave them pomegranate seeds, asked them questions, not about what they knew, but how they felt. All answered the same. "She's still listening." She, presumably, being Makari, one child added, "She's not mad, just waiting." And then, another surprise. A trader from the far north arrived bearing an artifact, a golden amulet shaped like a knot, looped with eyes. He claimed it had been found inside a sealed tomb that no one remembered sealing. When presented to Amos, the pharaoh smiled faintly. He didn't touch it, just nodded and said, "Put it beside the temple." So the amulet was placed outside the spiral temple on a small plinth. No one ever moved it again. Years passed. Pharaoh Amos eventually stepped down, not in disgrace, not through death, but simply, gently. He handed his crook and flail to his successor, then walked barefoot into the desert, toward the spiral. The guards followed him to the temple gates, but stopped there, because he asked them to, and then he disappeared. Some say he walked the spiral inward until he reached the center and was simply no longer there. Others say he sat down, leaned against the wall, and exhaled so slowly that time itself forgot to notice. No one knows. What they do know is that afterward, the temple never accepted another visitor. Every door sealed, every crack vanished, the sand piled high around it, burying the walls inch by inch, until it became just another dune among thousands. But people didn't forget, not entirely. Travelers who passed near the area sometimes reported soft music drifting from the sand. Others claimed to feel lighter, like thoughts were being gently lifted from their heads. A merchant left a loaf of bread on the spot, returned days later to find it untouched but warm. Historians still argue whether the spiral temple was real, or some elaborate metaphor in state records. One particularly stubborn scholar insists it was an early psychological care center, masked as a religious monument. Sure, and crocodiles wear hats. And speaking of oddities, remember that child who drew the jackal and beetle? Well, years later, he became a scribe, then a high priest, then retired mysteriously to a small island in the Nile where he built a shrine. No one ever saw inside, but once a year. At sunset, he'd float paper boats downriver, each boat carrying a spiral-shaped rock. He called them maps for the listener. Meanwhile, Egypt moved on, as Egypt does. New wars, new rulers, old gods given new names. But beneath the surface, something ancient lingered like the hum of stone under pressure. People still whispered about Makari. Some believed she became a star. Others said she had turned into a beetle so small it lived on the breath of those who remembered her. And only some believed she was waiting still, inside that sealed spiral, not gone at all, just listening. Egypt, for all its mysteries, had never truly forgotten how to remember. Decades passed, and the memory of Makari became one of those stories you didn't hear in official temple hymns. But somehow every child still knew. They whispered her name. During hide-and-seek, carved her spiral into the backs of fig leaves, even tried to draw her tomb from memory based on dreams. The spiral temple, though now fully buried, found its way back into Egypt's bloodstream in curious ways. New architects began designing homes in subtle spirals, not full circles. Mind you, just slightly curved halls or gentle turns at odd places, flow-enhancing. They called it good for the breeze. But every now and then, someone would glance at the floor plan and mutter Makari. No one corrected them. One notable exception was Pharaoh, Thutmose Young, bold, allergic to superstition, and absolutely terrified of beetles. He ordered a national ban on all spiral-shaped objects. For aesthetic purposes, he declared, though palace servants swore he once fainted after seeing a cinnamon bun. Of course, the ban didn't work. You can't outlaw a memory, especially one that refuses to die. That same year, an unusual event stirred Egypt's intellectual elite. A scroll surfaced in Heliopolis, inked entirely in reverse hieroglyphs, mirror writing. When finally deciphered, the scroll revealed a list of names. Each name belonged to someone not yet born. Some laughed, others panicked. One priest dramatically declared it the Second Awakening, but most just waited. Over the next 20 years, every name on that list appeared in real life. Normal people, farmers, weavers, one oddly gifted falconer, all unaware they'd once been written into a scroll years before they existed. The strangest part, each of them claimed to have dreams of a spiral door that caught the attention of a quiet, sandal-wearing priest named Nemenhotep. He wasn't flashy, didn't shout prophecy from rooftops, but he'd spent 30 years cataloging patterns, specifically dreams, temple graffiti, repeating names in tax records, and how often pigeons landed on the same statue of Thoth. One day he stood before the great library of Thebes and simply muttered, "It's not a spiral, it's a map." No one knew what he meant. Except a few days later, he vanished, left his scrolls behind. Though one scroll showed an overhead map of the Nile but twisted subtly into a spiral. At the center, a dot labeled Origin. Naturally, everyone freaked out. Expeditions were launched. Dig sites popped up like mushrooms after rain. Sand was moved by the ton. But nothing, just more sand, more heat, more theories, until one young girl, part of a worker's family, wandered off during a dust storm. She claimed she'd found the soft sand. When questioned, she explained, "It doesn't push back." That cryptic phrase somehow made it into royal records. And when a group of scholars went to test the area she described, their measuring rods sank deeper than expected. What they uncovered was not stone, nor brick, glass. A massive sheet of it, clear as water, smooth as silence. It took them weeks to brush off enough of it to understand the shape. A beetle's wing, fused into the earth. Not an artifact, a structure. That night, the stars blinked twice, and only once. The discovery was promptly declared decorative sedimentary formation. No further exploration permitted. But again, stories leaked out. The glass wing reflected not the sky above, but a different one entirely. Some said it showed stars that no longer existed. Others claimed it showed your childhood face, no matter your age. But everyone agreed. Standing near it made your thoughts go quiet, unsettlingly quiet. One scribe stood there for hours, then reported, "I forgot how to say my own name, but I felt okay about it." Historians still argue whether the glass wing was a remnant of an advanced civilization, a symbolic metaphor for collective consciousness, or just an unusually shaped mistake. A few suggested it was the beginning of something rather than the end. A hatch, a lock, a seed. And amid all this chaos, a small, unnoticed group of children descendants of the original dreamers gathered on their own, not as a cult, not as rebels, just as kids who knew something was happening and didn't want the adults to ruin it. They met by moonlight, shared dream fragments, and taught each other how to listen, not to sound, but to silence. The kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for you to finish your sentence before it responds. And just before this chapter in Egypt's story faded again into routine and wheat and sunburns, something quietly poetic occurred. A newborn child, no more than a week old, was was found cradled inside a crocodile nest, alive, unharmed, just staring up at the sky. They named her Amira, a name that didn't exist in any previous dynasty, script, or baby scroll, which of course made people very nervous. The high priest in Memphis insisted it was just a variant of Amira, but an old reed cutter swore he'd heard it whispered by the reeds during flood season. Either way, she became a kind of walking question mark. She didn't cry, didn't babble, just watched. By age 2, she spoke full sentences. By 3, she refused to walk in straight lines. When asked why, she replied, "Straight paths go nowhere." Interesting. Hard to argue with logic like that now. Egypt had seen prodigies before, scribes who memorized entire legal codes by age 10. A boy who could recite the names of 300 gods without blinking, though he was also allergic to onions. Poor soul. But Amira was different. She didn't seem eager to impress anyone. She was just listening, all the time, to something no one else heard. Her adoptive family's simple papyrus weavers tried to raise her normally, but normal gets complicated when your daughter hums melodies that match the wind currents or draws symbols in the sand that reflect real constellations. That night, once a merchant asked her where his missing camel had gone. She stared at his sandals and said, "She doesn't like the yellow walls." He returned home to repaint his courtyard. The camel came back that evening. The palace got involved. Obviously, Pharaoh Seti III dispatched a delegation to observe Amira. They returned with a strange report. She dreams with her eyes open. Seti, intrigued but cautious, summoned her to the court. When she arrived, she bowed once very slightly, then looked at the throne and said, "This is not your seat." Silence, uncomfortable, elongated silence. Then, laughter. Seti, to his credit, had a sense of humor. He called her "my little oracle" and gifted her a gold necklace shaped like a spiral, which she refused to wear. "Gold's too loud," she muttered, playing with a piece of limestone instead. And then, as all things do, the world shifted again. That same year, a series of tremors rippled across the Nile Valley. Not earthquakes. Those were rare and usually minor. These were subtler boats, drifted upstream without wind. Animals gathered at odd hours, all facing the same direction. Even statues from Swa began to lean ever so slightly to the left. Scribes started making accidental spirals in their hieroglyphs. One priest spilled ink and the blotch perfectly resembled a scarab. Wings flared it. All felt coordinated, like someone tuning an invisible harp. Then, a boy in Thebes claimed he saw a second moon appear above the horizon. It shimmered, flickered, and blinked out. Only he saw it, or so people thought, until 3 separate tomb murals painted before his birth depicted the exact same event. No one could explain it, except Amira. She said only, "The wing is turning." And from that moment, the glass beetle wing buried deep in the desert began to hum. Not loudly. Just a low, bone-level vibration that made sleep feel like swimming. People began dreaming again, real dreams, vivid, wild, complex dreams where rivers flowed backwards and crocodiles gave directions to lost souls. A few even dreamed of a spiral staircase made of moonlight. Amira, however, didn't dream at all. "I'm already inside the dream," she said once, while balancing on one foot in the middle of a sandstorm. Priests panicked. Astronomers panicked harder. The pharaoh did not panic, but he did build a circular library in her honor. Every scroll was copied in reverse. Every floor curved slightly. Even the cats walked in arcs. The people didn't mind. They had a new symbol now, not a god or pharaoh, but a girl. A still point in the middle of a widening loop. She didn't preach, didn't promise, didn't prophesy. She just was. And for some reason, that was enough. One day, during a solar eclipse, the first in decades, Amira vanished. Not dramatically, she simply walked into a spiral-shaped garden and didn't walk out. They searched for days, dug, chanted, lit every torch in Memphis, but all they found were tiny beetle tracks, leading into the roots of a fig tree. The wind stopped for 3 days, and then started blowing in the opposite direction. From that moment on, people began planting their homes in kerms again. Not religiously, just intuitively. And babies born during the next decade came into the world with spiral-shaped birthmarks, some on their wrists, some behind their ears, some, oddly enough, on their tongues. Historians still argue whether Amira was a prophet, a metaphor, or a leftover fragment of an ancient experiment gone weirdly poetic. But what no one denies is that, after she vanished, people remembered more vividly. They remembered their ancestors' names without trying. They remembered dreams they never knew they'd had. They remembered silence. Not emptiness, but the kind of silence that waits, just waits. And somewhere, deep beneath the sand, the beetle wing pulsed once more. The year of the double flood began with a whisper, not from the riverbanks, but from the stones themselves, a low, repetitive vibration beneath the soles of people's feet, like a heartbeat under the floor of the world. Farmers felt it first. Oxen refused to plow. Reeds bent away from the usual breeze, and one boy claimed his shadow started arriving before he did, which naturally led to rumors. Some said the gods were angry. Others believed Amira had returned not as a girl, but as a river spirit, reshaping time from below. The Nile agreed with the latter, because that summer it flooded twice, not in two stages, like an early crest and a retreat. Two distinct, massive floods 20 days apart. Temples and granaries, even the sophisticated nilometer stations, couldn't make sense of it. Bread prices soared, then plummeted, then soared again. One scribe fainted trying to adjust the tax calculations and woke up muttering, "The moon's laughing at us." No one quite knew what to do, and that's when the pharaoh made the strangest decree in centuries. He abolished the calendar, wiped it clean, declared the year of not yet. No months, no weeks, just open-ended days, marked only by the sound of the Nile, whether it gurgled, whispered, or roared. And in a weird twist of fate, people relaxed, freed from dates and deadlines. Farmers planted when the birds circled twice. Artisans sculpted only when they dreamed of a face. Even tax collectors grew poetic, scribbling phrases like ode when the herons laugh on collection scrolls. The weirdest part, productivity didn't plummet. If anything, it got weirder but better. People built circular boats, kids invented spiral games in the dust, and one baker created a loaf that looped around itself like a coiled rope. He called it Amira's bread, and it sold out daily. There was even a traveling performer who dressed entirely in mirrored linen and spun slowly on stage, while whispering nonsense about the sixth door behind the fifth pyramid. He was extremely popular, but not everything was quirky and quaint, because with the second flood came strangers. Pale-skinned wanderers from the western dunes, bearing gold discs and shells carved like animal eyes. They didn't speak the local tongue, but one woman among them carried a beetle-shaped flute that, when played, made scorpions fall asleep. She was brought to the palace. There she pointed to a wall mural, one that predated the current dynasty by hundreds of years, and simply said open. No one knew what she meant, but when they touched the wall where she pointed, it cracked and sang. Yes, the stone sang a high, brittle melody like wind through reeds, only sharper. Behind it was a chamber filled with polished bones, arranged in a perfect spiral. At the center, a mirror, not a polished metal plate, not obsidian, a real mirror, smooth, reflective, and cold, and not just cool to the touch, cold, like night inside a tomb. The flute woman looked into it once, gasped, and then simply vanished. No puff of smoke, just a ripple. Historians still argue whether she collapsed into the reflection or was never real to begin with, but the mirror remained. Pharaohs decreed it sacred. Priests encircled it with glyphs warning not to stare. Too long, children dared each other to look and often ran away laughing or crying. Only one, a boy named Netu, stared into it for 7 full minutes. He grew up to invent a system of spiral irrigation that doubled crop yields. Coincidence? Probably, or maybe not. As all this happened, the beetle wing beneath the sands pulsed again, this time in a different rhythm. Short, quick bursts, as if adjusting. As if speaking. A potter in Memphis claimed to hear actual words in his clay. Loop once, and loop again. What is round is not the end. People began painting circles everywhere. Not worshipfully, just instinctively. Sun discs became more common in amulets. Even funerary art shifted, no longer guiding the dead across, but rather around the afterlife. One particularly bold tomb painting showed a deceased man walking in a perfect circle while his heart weighed itself. Strange, absolutely. Comforting. Somehow, yes, because even though the world was spinning, in thought, in river and memory, it felt like it was spinning together. And while no one officially restored the calendar, People began marking days by dreams again. I dreamt of a blue jackal must be market day. 3 cranes nested upside down, time to restock the fish traps. Weird, but it worked. And the Nile still flowed, still gave, still whispered, still waited, because deep below the beat had not yet stopped. The year slipped by in coils, not lines. No months had passed officially, but somehow time had curled its way around the kingdom like a sleeping cobra. Days looped into each other until even the sun seemed to rise from a slightly different place, just to keep things interesting. And then the beetle woke. It didn't roar. It didn't burst forth in golden fire or summon an army of spectral ibis. It clicked. Just once. A small, precise sound like a pebble dropped into a bronze bowl. And somewhere in Thebes, an elderly woman woke up and said, "It's time." No one had spoken to her in 30 years, but now she was walking straight to the palace. When the guards tried to stop her, her breath turned their spears to rust. They wisely stepped aside. Inside the throne room, she bowed before the young pharaoh, still barely 15, and handed him a reed scroll wrapped in fish skin. She said, "This was written before you were born, but not by anyone alive." It read, "When time loops thrice and the sun forgets her path, the king must wear the crown beneath," which raised a few eyebrows. The only crown beneath. The throne had been found years ago, a small circlet carved from obsidian and teeth, resting under the foundation stone. It was dusty, slightly cursed looking, but hey, destiny's never neat. So the pharaoh wore it and immediately collapsed. Everyone panicked, of course, until he stood up, eyes wide, but calm, and began speaking. In perfect old Egyptian, a language dead for 1,000 years, he told them stories of the first beetle, not a scarab, but a black sun that rolled itself across the void before the world took shape, of the wars fought between calendars and moons, of a time when rivers ran backwards to hide secrets from the sky. The court scribes fainted twice, but no one dared interrupt. When the pharaoh finished, he turned toward the mirror and said one word, "Home." And just like that, the mirror blinked. Yes, blinked, with an eyelid of shadow. The chamber dimmed. And for a moment, the entire kingdom heard it, a sound like 1,000 wings unfurling in slow motion. No wind, no storm. Just the beat of something old, stretching after a very long nap. That night, the Nile rose silently. No surge, no panic, just a smooth, impossible ascent. By morning, the fields were fed. No one drowned. Every granary was full. People whispered that time had reset, but not back to the beginning. Sideways. Like starting a song again, but in a new key. The stars rearranged themselves, subtly enough to confuse astronomers and delight poets. And dreams. Oh, dreams became louder. Children began waking up with new songs on their tongues, claiming the beetle taught me. Priests declared a new festival, the Great Curling. It involved floating paper boats in circular canals and baking bread, shaped like the Ouroboros. Even cats began behaving differently, more philosophical, less smug. One reportedly painted a spiral on a temple wall, using its tail and goat milk. And yet, life was good, not perfect, but curved in the right direction. People laughed more, argued in rhymes, and took naps, simply because their shadows leaned in too close. And as for the pharaoh, he ruled gently, never aged, and only ever wore the obsidian crown. Some say he was a scarab in disguise. Others insist he was just a boy who listened. But one thing became clear. Egypt didn't just survive her wars, floods, famines, and whispers. She remembered them, tucked them into her folds like sacred wrinkles. And when time curled again in it, always did, she was ready, always had been, always would be. Now, if you're still awakened, somehow not painting spiral cats on your ceiling, it's time to drift. So let's slow things down for the last few moments. Let the dust settle in the temples. Let the Nile hum softly under the moonlight, full and unhurried. Picture the torchlight flickering along sandstone walls, illuminating faces carved long before your ancestors took their first breath. Let your breathing match the lazy swirl of that river, in and out, coiling gently around sleep. Let your body feel ancient and weightless, like a reed floating sideways across a mirrored pool. Because time doesn't need to move in a straight line. Tonight, not here, not with us, just drift, loop once, loop again. What is round is not the end.